The desert heat shimmered across the barren landscape as Hannah Morgan stood at her husband's grave, the freshly turned earth a stark reminder that she was now completely alone in the world. The year was 1878, and at 25 years old, Hannah had already experienced more loss than most endured in a lifetime. "I promise you, Thomas," she whispered, her voice catching on the hot Arizona wind, "no man will ever take your place, not now, not ever." The small town of Cottonwood Springs had been her home for 3 years, ever since Thomas had brought her west with dreams of building a cattle ranch. Those dreams had died with him 2 weeks ago when a rustler's bullet had stolen his life and her future. Now, all that remained was the modest homestead 5 miles outside of town, a few head of cattle, and a broken heart that Hannah wasn't sure would ever heal. The walk back to her wagon was long and silent. She nodded politely to the townsfolk who offered their condolences, but the words rang hollow in her ears. What good were sympathies when she had to face the empty cabin alone? What comfort could be found in platitudes about time healing all wounds when the pain felt as fresh as the moment the sheriff had knocked on her door with his hat in his hands? Hannah climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. She had no tears left to cry. All that remained was determination to keep the ranch running, to honor Thomas's memory by not failing, and most importantly, to guard her heart against ever feeling such devastating loss again. The sun was setting by the time she reached her property, casting long shadows across the yard. The small cabin that had once felt cozy now seemed to echo with emptiness. The barn needed repair, the fence around the corral was sagging, and the vegetable garden was overrun with weeds. There was too much work for one person, but Hannah had no choice. This was her life now. As she unhitched the horses, she heard Mrs. Abernathy's words from after the funeral. "You're young, Hannah. In time you'll find another husband." Hannah had smiled politely, but inside she had made her vow. No man would ever have the chance to leave her widowed again. She would rather face life alone than risk loving and losing once more. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the world hadn't been shattered. Hannah rose before the sun, donned her husband's old work shirt over her dress, and set about her chores. The cattle needed tending, the chickens were hungry, and there was mending to be done. She worked until her muscles ached and sweat soaked through her clothes, finding solace in exhaustion. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Summer faded into fall, and with it came the cattle drive season. Hannah knew she couldn't manage it alone, so she sold most of the herd to the neighboring Dawson ranch, keeping only enough to sustain herself. The money would last through winter if she was careful. Winter in Arizona wasn't as harsh as in other territories, but the nights grew cold, and the solitude grew colder. Hannah took to talking to herself just to hear a human voice. Sometimes, when the wind howled around the cabin eaves, she imagined it was Thomas answering back. She refused invitations to town socials and declined dinner offers from well-meaning neighbors. The women of Cottonwood Springs whispered that Hannah Morgan was becoming strange, perhaps touched by grief. The men, those who were single or widowed themselves, learned quickly that any attempt at courtship was met with a polite but firm rebuff. "I'm managing just fine on my own," became her standard response, delivered with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. By spring of 1879, Hannah had settled into her solitary existence. The ranch was smaller now, more manageable for one person, though she still worked from dawn until dusk. Her hands were calloused, her skin bronzed by the sun, and her heart, she believed, sufficiently armored against further pain. It was a Tuesday in April when everything changed. Hannah was hanging laundry on the line, fighting with a sheet that threatened to billow away in the spring breeze, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Visitors were rare at the Morgan Ranch these days, and Hannah wasn't expecting anyone. She shaded her eyes against the sun and watched as a rider came into view. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders outlined against the sky. As he drew closer, she could make out more details: dark hair beneath a worn Stetson, a clean-shaven jaw, and something colorful cradled in one arm. Hannah frowned and dropped the clothespin she was holding. She smoothed her hair back from her face, suddenly aware of her appearance: faded dress, dirty apron, and wind-blown hair. Not that it mattered. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, least of all some stranger riding onto her property unannounced. The man reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "Mrs. Morgan," he called. Hannah approached cautiously, one hand shielding her eyes. "Yes, can I help you?" The stranger dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with eyes the color of a summer sky and smile lines etched at their corners. The name's Dawson, Daniel Dawson. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I bought most of your cattle last fall." Hannah nodded, recognition dawning. She dealt with the foreman of the Dawson ranch, not the owner himself. "Mr. Dawson, what brings you all the way out here?" Daniel Dawson shifted, suddenly looking less sure of himself. From the crook of his arm, he produced what he'd been carrying: a small bouquet of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dusty landscape. "These are for you, madam," he said, extending them toward her. "I heard about your loss. I know it's been some months now, but I've been away on business in Denver until recently." Hannah stared at the flowers as if they were a rattlesnake about to strike. No one had given her flowers since Thomas had courted her years ago. The gesture was so unexpected, so unwelcome, that for a moment she couldn't find words. "I don't need your sympathy, Mr. Dawson," she finally managed, not reaching for the bouquet. "And if you've come with an offer to buy the rest of my ranch, I'm not selling." Daniel's smile faltered, but he didn't withdraw the flowers. "No offers, Mrs. Morgan, just flowers and perhaps a proposition of a different sort." Hannah crossed her arms. "I'm not interested in propositions of any sort, Mr. Dawson." "It's about cattle," he clarified quickly, a flush creeping up his neck. "Your breeding stock is some of the finest I've seen in the territory. I was hoping we might discuss a partnership of sorts. Your cattle, my land and resources." Hannah hesitated. Her remaining cattle were indeed good stock, but without help, she couldn't expand the herd again. Still, a partnership meant entangling her life with someone else's, and she'd sworn not to do that. "I work alone, Mr. Dawson." Daniel nodded, as if he'd expected this response. He finally lowered the flowers but didn't put them away. "Mrs. Morgan, I understand your reluctance, but this would be strictly business. Your husband had a good eye for cattle. It would be a shame to let that bloodline diminish." The mention of Thomas made Hannah's chest tighten. She glanced toward the house, suddenly wanting this man gone from her property. "I'll think about it," she said, though she had no intention of doing so. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." To her surprise, Daniel didn't leave. Instead, he gestured toward the sagging fence of the corral. "That looks like it could use some attention. I have a few hours before I need to head back. Let me help." "That's not necessary." "I insist," Daniel said, already removing his jacket. Beneath it, he wore a simple cotton shirt, rolled up at the sleeves to reveal strong forearms tanned by the sun. "Consider it payment for taking up your time." Before Hannah could protest further, Daniel had tied his horse to a post and was examining the corral fence. She watched, bewildered, as he began collecting tools from her shed without asking permission. There was something unsettling about his easy confidence, about the way he moved around her property as if he belonged there. "Mr. Dawson, really, this isn't—" "Call me Daniel," he interrupted, measuring a length of lumber against the broken fence rail. "And it's no trouble. These repairs won't take long with 2 sets of hands." Hannah found herself trapped between politeness and her desire to maintain distance. In the end, practicality won out. The fence did need fixing, and having help would make the job go faster. "Fine," she conceded, rolling up her own sleeves. "But this doesn't mean I'm agreeing to your partnership idea." Daniel grinned, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Understood, Mrs. Morgan." "Hannah," she corrected, then immediately regretted the familiarity. "If you're to call me by my given name, that is." "Hannah," he repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. Then he handed her a hammer. "Shall we?" They worked side by side for the next 2 hours, saying little but accomplishing much. Daniel was skilled with his hands and seemed to anticipate what was needed before Hannah could ask. By late afternoon, the corral fence was sturdy again, and they'd even managed to repair a loose board on the barn door that had been bothering Hannah for weeks. As they finished, Daniel wiped sweat from his brow and looked up at the sky. "I should be heading back. It'll be dark soon." Hannah nodded, suddenly aware that she'd spent the afternoon in the company of a man and hadn't once thought of her vow to remain alone. The realization disturbed her. "Thank you for your help," she said stiffly, putting distance between them. Daniel retrieved his hat and jacket, then untied his horse. The bouquet of wildflowers still lay on a nearby stump where he'd placed them. He picked them up, their blooms slightly wilted now in the afternoon heat. "These are still yours," he said, offering them again. No strings attached, Hannah. Just a neighbor being neighborly. This time, something in his earnest expression made Hannah reach out and accept the flowers. Their sweet scent wafted up, reminding her of happier times. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel mounted his horse with practiced ease. "I'll be back in a week to discuss that partnership," he said. "In the meantime, think about it. Your husband built something worth preserving here." Before Hannah could remind him that she hadn't agreed to any further discussion, Daniel tipped his hat and rode away, leaving her standing in the yard with wildflowers in her hand and confusion in her heart. That night, Hannah placed the flowers in a mason jar on her kitchen table. Their bright colors seemed out of place in the Spartan cabin, just as Daniel Dawson seemed out of place in her carefully constructed solitude. She told herself she'd only accepted his help because it was practical, and she'd only taken the flowers to be polite. The partnership offer was still out of the question. Yet as she prepared for bed, Hannah found herself wondering what Thomas would think of Daniel Dawson. Her husband had been a good judge of character. Would he have approved of this neighbor with his easy smile and willingness to help? "It doesn't matter," she said aloud to the empty cabin. "I'm not getting involved in business or otherwise." But even as she made this declaration, Hannah glanced at the wildflowers on the table and felt something stir within her that she'd thought long-dead curiosity. True to his word, Daniel Dawson returned exactly 1 week later. This time, Hannah was better prepared. She'd spent the intervening days telling herself that she would politely but firmly decline any business offer, thank him for his help with the fence, and send him on his way. What she hadn't prepared for was the sight of Daniel riding up with a young boy perched in front of him on the saddle. The child couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with a mop of dark curls that matched Daniel's and the same striking blue eyes. Hannah stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been baking bread, and the scent of it followed her into the yard. "Good morning, Hannah," Daniel called, dismounting and then lifting the boy down. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought my son along today. This is Jack." The boy gave a shy smile and a small bow that seemed rehearsed. "Pleased to meet you, madam." Hannah felt her carefully constructed resolve wavering. No one had mentioned that Daniel Dawson was a father. "Hello, Jack," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "It's nice to meet you too." Daniel rested his hands on his son's shoulders. "Jack's mother passed when he was just 3, he explained, his voice matter of fact but with an undercurrent of old pain. "It's been just the 2 of us since then." The information hit Hannah like a physical blow. Daniel was a widower just as she was a widow. He knew the pain of loss, the emptiness of a bed half filled, the silence where a loved one's voice should be. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Daniel nodded in acknowledgement. "We manage, don't we, Jack?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Pa says you have chickens. Could I see them?" Hannah found herself smiling despite her resolve to remain detached. "Yes, I do. They're probably hungry by now. Would you like to help me feed them?" Jack's face lit up. "Could I?" Hannah glanced at Daniel, who gave an encouraging nod. "Go ahead, son. I'll be right here." As Jack followed Hannah to the chicken coop, chattering excitedly about his own experiences with the chickens at their ranch, Hannah felt a strange lightness in her chest. It had been so long since she'd heard a child's voice, so long since she'd had someone look at her with such uncomplicated happiness. They fed the chickens together, Jack laughing delightedly when the hens crowded around his feet for the corn he scattered. Hannah found herself laughing too, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. When they returned to where Daniel waited, Hannah was more relaxed than she'd been in months. Your son has quite a way with animals, she told him. Daniel beamed with paternal pride. He does at that. Takes after his mother in that regard. He looked at Jack with such love that Hannah felt a pang of envy, not for Daniel specifically, but for what they had, this father and son who had faced loss together and found a way forward. Now, Jack, Daniel said, why don't you go explore the yard while Mrs. Morgan and I talk business? Stay where we can see you. Yes, Pa. Jack scampered off to investigate a grasshopper that had caught his attention. Daniel turned to Hannah, his expression growing more serious. Have you thought about my proposition? Hannah had indeed thought about it more than she cared to admit. I have, she said cautiously, but I'm still not convinced it's the right move for me. Daniel nodded, seeming unsurprised. What if I were to show you my operation? The Dawson Ranch is only an hour's ride from here. You could see how we run things, meet the hands, and then decide if a partnership might benefit you. It was a reasonable suggestion, and Hannah found herself without a ready refusal. The truth was, she was curious about the Dawson Ranch. And if she was being completely honest with herself, she was curious about Daniel too, this man who had lost his wife but somehow managed to build a life and raise a son on his own. I suppose that would be sensible, she admitted, but I have chores that need tending to daily. This Sunday, Daniel suggested, we could send one of my hands to watch your place for the day. Jack and I would be happy to have you for Sunday dinner as well. The idea of a proper Sunday dinner, one she didn't have to cook herself, was tempting. Hannah couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a meal she hadn't prepared with her own hands. All right, she found herself saying. This Sunday? Daniel's smile made her stomach do a strange little flip that she immediately suppressed. This was business, nothing more. The fact that Daniel Dawson had a nice smile and kind eyes didn't change anything about her resolve to keep men at arm's length. Wonderful, Daniel said. I'll send someone for you around 10 in the morning if that suits. Hannah nodded, already wondering if she'd made a mistake. But before she could reconsider, Jack came running back, clutching something in his small hands. Mrs. Morgan, look what I found. He opened his palms to reveal a tiny blue jay chick, its feathers barely grown in. It fell from its nest. Hannah knelt to examine the bird. Oh, the poor thing. Where did you find it? Jack pointed to a tree near the edge of the yard. There's a nest up high. I think it fell out. Daniel joined them, looking concerned. Can it be saved? Hannah gently took the chick from Jack's hands. If we can get it back to its nest, yes. But it's too high for me to reach. I can climb trees, Jack offered eagerly. No, son, Daniel said firmly. That's too dangerous. He studied the tree. I can reach it if I stand on my horse's back. I've done it before when rounding up strays in difficult terrain. Hannah watched as Daniel led his horse beneath the tree branch where the nest was visible. With remarkable agility, he stepped from the saddle onto the horse's back, balancing carefully as he reached up toward the nest. Hannah held her breath, afraid he would fall, but his movements were sure and controlled. Hand me the little one, he called down. Hannah passed the chick to Jack, who stretched up on tiptoes to give it to his father. Daniel placed the bird back in its nest, checking to make sure it was secure before carefully dismounting. There, he said, patting his horse's neck in thanks. Mother bird will take care of it now. You saved it, Jack exclaimed, his face glowing with admiration for his father. Hannah found herself equally impressed, though she tried not to show it. There was something about the care Daniel had taken with the helpless creature, the way he'd risked his own safety without hesitation, that spoke volumes about his character. Thank you, she said. That was very kind. Daniel shrugged, seeming embarrassed by the praise. It was nothing, just the right thing to do. But it wasn't nothing, Hannah thought. In a world where many men would have simply left the bird to its fate, Daniel Dawson had gone out of his way to save it. Just as he'd gone out of his way to help with her fence, to bring her flowers, to offer a business partnership that would benefit her as much as him. For the first time since Thomas's death, Hannah felt a crack forming in the wall she'd built around her heart. It frightened her, this unexpected vulnerability, and she took a step back, both physically and emotionally. I should get back to my baking, she said, her voice cooler than before. The bread will be burning. If Daniel noticed the change in her demeanor, he gave no sign. Of course. Jack and I should be heading back anyway. We'll see you Sunday, Hannah. As they rode away, Jack turned in the saddle to wave goodbye. Hannah waved back, watching until they disappeared from sight. Then she went inside and leaned against the closed door, trying to steady her breathing. "This is business," she told herself firmly. "Nothing more. I'm not interested in Daniel Dawson or any man. I made a promise to Thomas and I intend to keep it." But as she returned to her baking, Hannah couldn't help but wonder if her late husband would really want her to spend the rest of her life alone. Thomas had been a loving, generous man. Would he truly wish this solitary existence on her? The question haunted her for the rest of the week. Sunday dawned clear and warm, a perfect spring day in the Arizona territory. Hannah woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She told herself it was merely apprehension about the business discussion ahead, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. She dressed with more care than usual, selecting a blue calico dress that Thomas had always said brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. Her brown hair, normally braided and pinned up practically for work, she arranged in a softer style, with tendrils framing her face. Then, disgusted with herself for such vanity, she almost took it all down again. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, staring at her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. "I'm going to discuss cattle breeding, not to a social call," but she left her hair as it was. At precisely 10 o'clock, a wagon pulled into her yard, driven by a young man in a cowboy hat who introduced himself as Pete, one of the Dawson ranch hands. "Mr. Dawson sent me to fetch you, madam," he said politely, "and to look after your place while you're gone." Hannah provided Pete with instructions for feeding the livestock and checking the chicken eggs, then allowed him to help her into the wagon. As they pulled away from the ranch, she felt a momentary panic. This was the first time since Thomas's death that she had left her property in someone else's care. "Your boss," she said to Pete as they rode, "has he owned the Dawson ranch long?" Pete, who couldn't have been more than 20, grinned. "Mr. Daniel, yes, madam." It was his pa's before him and his granddad's before that, one of the first ranches in these parts. Mr. Daniel's been running it himself since his pa passed about 8 years back. "And he's been widowed for how long, young Mrs. Dawson?" Pete's expression grew solemn. "That was a sad business. Childbirth fever took her about 4 years ago. Mr. Daniel was near broken by it, wouldn't have made it through if not for little Jack needing him." Hannah absorbed this information silently, so Daniel had been alone even longer than she had. Yet somehow he'd managed to continue running his ranch and raising his son. The admiration she'd felt earlier in the week deepened. "Mr. Daniel's a good man," Pete continued, seemingly eager to sing his employer's praises. "Fair to his hands, kind to those in need. When my ma was sick last winter, he paid for the doctor himself and gave me time off to care for her." By the time they reached the Dawson ranch, Hannah had heard enough stories about Daniel's generosity and integrity to make a saint blush. She took the tales with a grain of salt. Loyal employees often exaggerated their boss's virtues, but the consistent theme was impossible to ignore. Daniel Dawson was well respected and well liked by those who knew him best. The ranch itself was impressive, far larger than Hannah had anticipated. A sprawling main house, painted white with green shutters, sat on a gentle rise overlooking acres of grazing land. Several outbuildings, including a large barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a foreman's cottage, dotted the property. A corral near the main house held several fine-looking horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed contentedly. Daniel and Jack were waiting on the front porch as the wagon pulled up. Jack ran down the steps as soon as he spotted her, his face alight with excitement. "Mrs. Morgan, you came. Pa said you might change your mind, but I told him you wouldn't cause you promised." Hannah couldn't help but smile at the boy's enthusiasm. "I did promise, didn't I? And I always keep my promises." Daniel approached more slowly, but his smile was no less warm. "Welcome to Dawson Ranch, Hannah. I hope the journey wasn't too tiring." He looked different today, cleaner, more polished. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a crisp white shirt under a well-tailored vest. Hannah suddenly felt self-conscious about her own appearance, despite the care she'd taken. "Not at all," she assured him. Your man Pete was good company. Daniel helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The contact was brief but left Hannah feeling strangely flustered. She stepped away quickly, focusing her attention on the ranch buildings to hide her discomfort. Your property is very impressive, she said, and meant it. How many acres? Just over 2,000, Daniel replied, most of it good grazing land. We run about 800 head of cattle plus horses. He gestured toward the main house. Would you like to freshen up before we tour the operation? Mrs. Harding, our housekeeper, has prepared a light refreshment. Hannah nodded, grateful for the chance to collect herself. Jack took her hand without hesitation, eager to show her inside. His small fingers wrapped trustingly around hers, and Hannah felt an unexpected surge of emotion. She and Thomas had hoped for children, but fate had denied them that joy. Now, feeling Jack's hand in hers, she experienced a sharp pang of what might have been. The house was as impressive inside as out, comfortably furnished with a mix of practical pieces and what appeared to be family heirlooms. Photographs adorned the walls, and Hannah found herself drawn to one of a young woman holding an infant. The resemblance to Jack was unmistakable. That's my mama, Jack said, noticing her interest. I don't remember her much, but Pa says I have her smile. You do, Hannah said softly, studying the woman's kind face. She was very beautiful. Her name was Rebecca, Daniel said from behind them, his voice quiet. She would have liked you, I think. The simple statement touched Hannah deeply. She turned to find Daniel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them, the knowledge of what it meant to love and lose, to carry on for the sake of what remained. The moment was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Harding, a plump, cheerful woman who ushered Hannah to a guest room to freshen up, and then served coffee and freshly baked scones in the dining room. The housekeeper clearly doted on Jack, ruffling his hair affectionately and slipping him an extra scone when she thought Daniel wasn't looking. After refreshments, Daniel showed Hannah around the ranch. They started with the barn and stables, where sleek horses poked their heads over stall doors to investigate the visitors. Then they toured the cattle pens, where Daniel explained his breeding program in detail. Hannah was impressed by his knowledge and the clear results of his methods. The Dawson cattle were indeed some of the finest she'd seen. This is where your herd would come in, Daniel explained as they stood watching a group of cows with calves at their sides. Your stock has different strengths than mine. Together, we could produce an even hardier, more valuable breed. The business proposition was sound, Hannah had to admit. And Daniel was proposing a true partnership, not simply buying her out or absorbing her small operation into his larger one. He spoke of our cattle and our breeding program, including her in the vision of the future. It's a lot to consider, she said as they walked back toward the house. Jack had run ahead to help Mrs. Harding set the table for Sunday dinner, leaving them alone for the first time that day. Of course, Daniel agreed. I don't expect an answer today. I just wanted you to see what we've built here, what we could build together. The "we" gave Hannah pause. It sounded dangerously like more than a business arrangement. Mr. Dawson, Daniel, she corrected herself. I should be clear. I'm interested in discussing a cattle breeding partnership, nothing more. I'm not looking for. She trailed off, unsure how to finish without sounding presumptuous. Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. Hannah, I understand your caution. Believe me, I do. When Rebecca died, I thought my heart had died with her. The idea of caring for someone again, of risking that kind of loss. He shook his head. It terrified me. Hannah swallowed hard. Then you understand why I can't. I understand why you think you can't, he interrupted gently. But Hannah, life goes on. It has to. We owe it to those we've lost to live fully, not just survive. His words struck a chord deep within her. Wasn't that what Thomas would want for her? Not this half-life of work and solitude, but a real life with purpose and perhaps even joy. Before she could respond, Jack called from the porch. Pa, Mrs. Harding says dinner's ready, and if you don't come now, the roast will be ruined, Daniel smiled ruefully. We'd better not keep Mrs. Harding waiting. She rules this house with an iron fist, despite what she might tell you. Dinner was a surprisingly enjoyable affair. Mrs. Harding had outdone herself with a roast beef, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, and a peach cobbler that melted in the mouth. Jack kept them entertained with stories of his adventures around the ranch, occasionally embellished to the point that Daniel had to gently correct the more fantastical elements. Jack has his mother's imagination, he explained, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. Rebecca used to make up the most wonderful bedtime stories. "Do you tell stories, Mrs. Morgan?" Jack asked, his blue eyes wide with interest. Hannah shook her head. "I'm afraid I'm not very good at making things up. But you must know some," Jack insisted. "Everyone knows stories." Hannah thought for a moment. "Well, my father used to tell me stories about Paul Bunyan and his blue ox, babe. Do you know those?" Jack shook his head eagerly, and before Hannah quite knew what was happening, she found herself recounting the tall tales her father had shared during her childhood. Jack listened with rapt attention, his dessert forgotten as she described the giant lumberjack who could fell a forest with a single swing of his axe. When she finished, Jack applauded enthusiastically. "That was wonderful. Pa, wasn't that a good story?" Daniel, who had been watching Hannah with a warm expression that made her cheeks heat, nodded. "It certainly was. You've been holding out on us, Hannah. You're a natural storyteller." The praise made her uncomfortable but also secretly pleased. It had been so long since she'd thought about those old tales, so long since she'd shared anything of herself with others. After dinner, Jack reluctantly went upstairs for his afternoon nap, extracting a promise from Hannah that she would tell him another story before she left. Mrs. Harding disappeared to the kitchen, leaving Hannah and Daniel alone in the parlor. "Your son is delightful," Hannah said, breaking the slightly awkward silence. "You've done a remarkable job raising him on your own." Daniel's expression softened. "Jack makes it easy. He has a good heart." He hesitated, then added, "He's taken quite a shine to you. He doesn't usually warm up to strangers so quickly." Hannah didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was, she'd taken a shine to Jack as well. His openness, his curiosity, his easy affection all reminded her of the children she'd once hoped to have with Thomas. "About the partnership," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "I'm inclined to accept your proposal on a trial basis. Perhaps for one breeding season to see how our stock does together." Daniel looked pleased but not surprised, as if he'd known she would come around to the idea. "I think that's a sensible approach. We can draw up the terms this week if you'd like." Hannah nodded, relieved to be discussing business again. "That would be acceptable. I could come to town on Thursday, or I could come to your ranch," Daniel suggested. "Save you the trip. And Jack would love to see those chickens again." Hannah found herself agreeing before she could think better of it. The idea of Jack's bright face lighting up her summer homestead was too appealing to resist. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly. Daniel showed Hannah his late wife's garden, which he and Jack maintained in her memory. The spring blooms were just beginning to emerge, painting the garden beds with splashes of color against the dark soil. Rebecca loved flowers, Daniel said, kneeling to pull a weed from around a clump of daffodils. She said a ranch needed beauty as well as function. "The wildflowers, I brought you those were the kinds she used to collect on rides around the property." The revelation that the bouquet had been more than a casual gesture made Hannah view it in a new light. Daniel had shared something personal, something connected to his beloved wife's memory. "It was thoughtful of you," she said softly. "They brightened my kitchen for days." Daniel stood, brushing soil from his hands. "That's what flowers are supposed to do, bring brightness where it's needed." He looked at her directly, his blue eyes intent. "Everyone deserves a little brightness in their life, Hannah, even those of us who have known darkness." Before Hannah could respond to this philosophical observation, Jack came bounding into the garden, refreshed from his nap and eager for the promised story. Hannah spent the next half hour on a bench beneath an apple tree, telling Jack about Pico's Bill and his wild adventures in the West. Daniel sat nearby, ostensibly reading a newspaper but clearly listening to the tale as well, smiling at the funny parts and raising an eyebrow at the more outlandish claims. All too soon, it was time for Hannah to return home. Pete brought the wagon around and Daniel helped her up onto the seat after she'd said goodbye to Jack, who extracted a promise that she would come back soon to tell him more stories. "Thank you for today," Hannah said as Daniel handed her the reins. "It was not what I expected." Daniel's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Hannah found herself smiling back. "A good thing, I think." "I'll see you Thursday then, around noon," Hannah nodded. "Thursday at noon, for business," she added as much to remind herself as him. Daniel stepped back from the wagon, his expression unreadable. "For business," he agreed. "Safe journey, Hannah." As Pete drove her home, Hannah found herself replaying the day in her mind: Jack's laughter, Mrs. Harding's motherly fussing, the impressive ranch operations, and most of all, Daniel's words about deserving brightness after darkness. She had gone to the Dawson ranch expecting to make a business decision. Instead, she had been reminded of what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself, to be welcomed and valued not just for what she could contribute to a cattle breeding program, but for who she was. It was a dangerous realization for someone who had sworn off emotional connections. Because despite her best efforts, Hannah Morgan was beginning to care about the Dawsons, both the father and the son. And caring meant risking loss all over again. By the time Thursday arrived, Hannah had convinced herself that her interest in the Dawsons was purely practical. The partnership made good business sense. Jack was a charming child who made her smile, nothing more. And Daniel was a neighbor and potential business partner who happened to be kind and competent and understand loss in a way few others did. These rationalizations crumbled the moment she saw them riding up to her ranch. Jack once again seated before his father on the saddle, both of them smiling widely as they approached. Jack was clutching something in his hand, waving it excitedly. "Mrs. Morgan, look what I brought you." He called as they dismounted. Hannah stepped off the porch to greet them, unable to suppress her own smile. "What is it, Jack?" The boy opened his hand to reveal a small wooden carving of a chicken. "I made it myself. Pa helped with the sharp parts, but I did most of it." "It's for you to remember our visit." Hannah took the carving, touched beyond words by the simple gift. The chicken was rough-hewn but recognizable, with a jaunty comb and a rounded body. "Jack, this is wonderful. Did you really make this yourself?" Jack nodded proudly. "Pa's teaching me wood carving. He says I have a natural talent." "He's not wrong," Hannah said, carefully tucking the carving into her apron pocket. "Thank you. I'll keep it on my mantle where I can see it every day." Jack beamed, then immediately asked if he could go see the real chickens. When Hannah nodded her permission, he darted off toward the coop, leaving her alone with Daniel. "That's quite a boy you have," Hannah said, watching Jack crouch down to greet the hens as if they were old friends. "He is," Daniel agreed, pride evident in his voice. "Though I can't take all the credit, he was born with that kind heart." Hannah turned to find Daniel watching her rather than his son. There was something in his gaze that made her breath catch a warmth, an interest that went beyond neighborly politeness. "I've brought the partnership agreement," he said, seeming to sense her discomfort and changing the subject. "It's straightforward, but you should read it carefully before signing." Hannah nodded, grateful for the return to business. "Of course, let's go inside." They settled at her kitchen table, the contract between them. As Hannah read through the document, she had to admit it was eminently fair. Daniel was proposing a 50-50 split of any profits from the joint breeding program, with clear provisions for how the cattle would be managed and how any disputes would be resolved. "This seems reasonable," she said when she'd finished reading. "Though I'd like to add a clause about what happens if either of us wants to end the partnership." Daniel nodded. "That's sensible. What do you suggest?" They spent the next hour discussing terms, modifying the agreement to address Hannah's concerns. Throughout the conversation, Daniel was respectful of her input and quick to accommodate her suggestions. By the time they'd finished, Hannah felt confident that her interests were protected. "I think we have a deal," she said, dipping her pen in ink to sign the amended contract. Daniel signed as well, then offered his hand to shake on the agreement. Hannah hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle, his palm warm against hers. The handshake lasted a moment longer than strictly necessary, and when Daniel finally released her hand, Hannah felt oddly bereft. "This calls for a celebration," Daniel declared. "I brought a picnic lunch if you'd care to join Jack and me." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "You were that confident I'd agree to the partnership?" Daniel had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Not confident, hopeful, and I figured we'd all need to eat, regardless of how our business discussion went." The thoughtfulness of the gesture was typical of what Hannah was coming to expect from Daniel Dawson. She found herself agreeing to the picnic before she could think better of it. They ate under the shade of a large cottonwood tree near the creek that ran along the edge of Hannah's property. Mrs. Harding had packed a feast: fried chicken, biscuits, pickled vegetables, and apple tarts for dessert. Jack entertained them with stories about his school friends and his pony, Pepper, while Daniel occasionally interjected to correct particularly extravagant claims. It was the most pleasant meal Hannah had experienced in longer than she could remember. Sitting on a blanket in the dappled shade, listening to Jack's chatter and watching Daniel's patient interactions with his son, she felt something inside her begin to thaw a cold, hard place that had formed around her heart the day Thomas died. After they'd eaten, Jack discovered a shallow part of the creek where minnows darted among the rocks. Daniel helped him roll up his pants and wade in to try to catch them, both of them laughing as the tiny fish evaded the boys' eager hands. Hannah watched from the blanket, a strange longing building in her chest. This was what she had dreamed of with Thomas: a family, a child of their own to love and teach and watch grow. The dream had died with him, or so she'd believed. But seeing Jack's joy and Daniel's fatherly pride awakened echoes of that old yearning. "Come join us," Daniel called, gesturing for her to approach the creek. "The water's perfect." Hannah shook her head. "I'm fine here, thank you," but Jack was more persuasive. "Please, Mrs. Morgan." "I almost caught one, but it got away. Maybe you'll have better luck." His pleading expression was impossible to resist. Hannah sighed and rose from the blanket, making her way to the creek bank. "I'm not taking off my shoes," she warned. "You don't have to," Daniel assured her. "Just watch for now." Hannah knelt on the grassy bank, peering into the clear water where silver minnows flashed in the sunlight. Jack continued his attempts to catch one, his small face scrunched in concentration. After several minutes of watching his increasingly dramatic failures, Hannah couldn't help but laugh. "You're scaring them, Jack," she explained. "You need to be still and let them come to you." To demonstrate, she dipped her hand slowly into the water and held it motionless just beneath the surface. After a moment, curious minnows began to investigate her fingers, darting in and away. "See," she said softly, "patience is key." Jack tried to mimic her technique, but his excitement made him jerky and impatient. The fish scattered each time he moved. Daniel, watching from a few feet away, caught Hannah's eye over his son's head and smiled a smile of shared understanding and appreciation for the boy's enthusiasm. The simple moment of connection sent a jolt through Hannah that she wasn't prepared for. She pulled her hand from the water abruptly, startling both Jack and the fish. "It's getting late," she said, standing quickly. "You should probably start back before it gets dark." Daniel looked up at the sky where the sun was still high. "We have plenty of daylight left, Hannah." But she was already walking back to the picnic blanket, needing distance from the dangerous feelings that threatened to overturn her carefully ordered existence. "I have chores to finish before evening," she insisted, gathering the remains of their meal. Daniel studied her face, seeming to understand her sudden withdrawal. "All right," he said quietly. "Jack, it's time to go, son." Jack protested but eventually trudged out of the creek, his pants wet despite their rolled-up state. As Daniel helped him into his boots, the boy looked up at Hannah with disappointment clear in his blue eyes. "Will you come visit us again soon?" he asked. "You could tell me another story." Hannah felt a pang of guilt for her abrupt ending to their pleasant afternoon. "Perhaps," she said, not wanting to make a promise she might not keep. "We'll see." They rode away soon after, Jack turning in the saddle to wave until they were out of sight. Hannah stood in her yard long after they'd gone, the wooden chicken carving a weight in her pocket that seemed heavier than its size should allow. That night, as promised, she placed the carving on her mantel. In the flickering light of the lamp, the rough-hewn chicken seemed to watch her with understanding eyes, a silent witness to her confusion. "This is business," she told it firmly, "just business." But even as she spoke the words, Hannah knew she was lying to herself. The Dawsons had already become more than business partners to her. They had become, against all her careful plans, people she cared about. And caring was the one thing she had sworn never to do again. Over the next several weeks, the business partnership with Daniel proceeded smoothly. The first of Hannah's breeding cattle were transported to the Dawson ranch, where they would be paired with Daniel's prize bulls. Daniel or his foreman provided regular updates, usually by messenger rather than in person. Hannah told herself she was relieved by Daniel's absence, though she couldn't deny a twinge of disappointment each time Pete or another ranch hand arrived instead of Daniel himself. She asked after Jack, of course, and sent along a book of tall tales she'd found in town that she thought he might enjoy. It was a neighborly gesture, nothing more. May turned to June, and the Arizona heat intensified. Hannah worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences, tending her remaining livestock, and fighting a constant battle against the encroaching desert that threatened her small vegetable garden. The work left her exhausted, but not too tired to wonder what the Dawsons were doing, whether Jack was enjoying the book, whether Daniel ever thought of her as more than a business partner. These thoughts irritated her. She had been managing perfectly well on her own before Daniel Dawson rode into her yard with wildflowers. She didn't need complications, especially not the kind that came with blue eyes and a dimpled smile. One particularly hot afternoon, as Hannah was struggling to repair a section of roof on her chicken coop, she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Expecting Pete with the weekly update, she was startled to see Daniel himself riding toward the house, alone this time. She climbed down from her precarious perch, suddenly aware of her appearance, hair escaping its braid, clothes stained with sweat and dirt, face likely red from exertion and heat. Not that it mattered what Daniel thought of how she looked, she reminded herself firmly. "Hannah," Daniel called in greeting as he dismounted. "Hard at work as usual, I see." The roof was leaking, she explained, pushing loose strands of hair back from her face. "Where's Jack today?" "At a friend's house in town. He's spending the night, his first time away from home." Daniel looked both proud and slightly worried. "I find myself at loose ends without him underfoot." Hannah nodded in understanding. "It's quiet when they're gone." "Too quiet," Daniel agreed. Then, noticing the ladder propped against the chicken coop, he frowned. "Were you up there alone?" "That's dangerous, Hannah," she bristled at his concern. "I've been doing these repairs by myself for over a year, Daniel. I'm quite capable." "I never suggested you weren't capable," he said mildly. "But even capable people can fall off ladders. At least let me help you finish." 4 hands are better than 2. Before Hannah could protest, Daniel had removed his hat and jacket and rolled up his sleeves. In the harsh sunlight, she could see that his forearms were tanned, and corded with muscle the arms of a man who worked alongside his ranch hands rather than merely directing them. "Fine," she conceded, not because she needed help but because arguing would take more energy than she currently possessed. "There are more shingles in the shed." They worked together in companionable silence for the next hour, replacing damaged shingles and securing loose ones. Daniel was as skilled with roofing as he had been with fence repair, moving confidently across the sloped surface. When the job was complete, Hannah invited him inside for coffee, a courtesy she would extend to any neighbor who had helped with a difficult task, she told herself. Daniel accepted with a smile that made her stomach flip in a way she chose to ignore. The interior of the cabin was cool compared to the blistering heat outside. Hannah pumped water into the sink to wash her hands and face, then set about preparing coffee while Daniel did the same. "Your place is looking good," he commented, glancing around the small but tidy main room. "You've accomplished a lot on your own." The simple observation, delivered without condescension, warmed Hannah more than it should have. "Thank you. It's been a lot of work, but worth it." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's how I felt after Rebecca died. The work kept me going, gave me purpose when I might have given up otherwise. Hannah placed mugs of coffee on the table and sat across from him. Does it get easier? She asked before she could stop herself. The loss, I mean. Daniel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not easier exactly, different. The sharp pain dulls over time, becomes more manageable. There are still days when it hits fresh: Jack's birthday, our anniversary, Christmas. But other days I can remember her with more joy than pain. He looked up, meeting Hannah's gaze directly. The hardest part was allowing myself to feel anything else: happiness, hope, interest in the future. It felt like a betrayal somehow. Hannah swallowed hard, recognition lancing through her. Yes, she whispered. Exactly that. They sat in silence for a moment, the understanding between them deeper than words could express. Then Daniel reached across the table and lightly touched the back of Hannah's hand, a brief, gentle contact that seemed to sear her skin. But it isn't a betrayal, Hannah. They wouldn't want that for us, Thomas or Rebecca. They loved us. They would want us to live fully, not just survive. It was the second time he had expressed this sentiment, and it resonated in Hannah's heart just as strongly as before. She withdrew her hand, not ready for the feelings his touch evoked. Jack enjoyed the book of tales, Daniel said, changing the subject as if sensing her discomfort. He insists I read from it every night, though he's perfectly capable of reading to himself. Hannah smiled, grateful for the lighter topic. He wants to share it with you, that's sweet. He misses you, Daniel said simply. He asks when you're coming to visit again. The admission caught Hannah off guard. Oh, I've been so busy with the ranch. Of course, Daniel nodded. But the invitation stands. Mrs. Harding mentions at least once a week that she'd like to cook for someone who properly appreciates her efforts, unlike those ravenous ranch hands who would eat shoe leather if she served it. Hannah laughed despite herself. She's a wonderful cook. Please tell her I said so. Tell her yourself, Daniel suggested. This Sunday, unless you have other plans. Hannah knew she should refuse. Visiting the Dawson ranch again would only deepen the connection she was trying so hard to avoid. But the thought of seeing Jack's bright face, of eating a meal she hadn't cooked herself, of perhaps even spending time in Daniel's garden, it was too tempting to resist. All right, she found herself saying. This Sunday, Daniel's smile was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. Wonderful. Jack will be thrilled, and so will Mrs. Harding. He paused, then added more softly, and so will I. The simple admission hung in the air between them, too honest to ignore but too new to acknowledge directly. Hannah busied herself with her coffee cup, not trusting herself to respond. They spent another hour discussing the cattle partnership, a safe topic that allowed Hannah to regain her emotional footing. By the time Daniel left, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple. He paused before mounting his horse, looking back at Hannah where she stood on the porch. Thank you for the coffee, he said. And for agreeing to visit. It means a lot to Jack. It will be nice to see him again, Hannah replied, carefully neutral. Daniel studied her face for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. Hannah, I know you're cautious, you have every right to be, but I want you to know that I understand what you've lost and I respect your need to protect yourself. He took a breath, then continued. I also want you to know that I enjoy your company very much, and not just as a business partner. Before Hannah could formulate a response to this startlingly direct statement, Daniel had mounted his horse and tipped his hat. Sunday at noon, he reminded her, then rode away, leaving Hannah staring after him with her heart pounding and her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. Sunday arrived with uncomfortable speed. Hannah spent the morning in a state of uncharacteristic indecision, changing her dress twice before settling on a sage green one that she'd rarely worn since Thomas's death. It had been his favorite, and wearing it had felt like reopening a wound. Today, though, she found she could look at herself in the mirror without that sharp pain, just a gentle ache of remembrance that was almost sweet. Pete arrived precisely at noon to drive her to the Dawson ranch. This time, Hannah's nervousness had nothing to do with leaving her property in someone else's care, and everything to do with the man and boy waiting for her at the end of the journey. Jack spotted the wagon first, running down the porch steps with a whoop of excitement. "Mrs. Morgan, you came." Hannah allowed Pete to help her down, then found herself enveloped in a fierce hug from Jack. The boy's unrestrained affection caught her by surprise, but after a moment's hesitation, she hugged him back, something inside her melting at the simple human contact. "I finished the book you sent," Jack informed her, stepping back but keeping hold of her hand as if afraid she might disappear. "My favorite was the one about the cowboy who lassoed a tornado. Do you think that could really happen?" Hannah pretended to consider the question seriously. "Well, it would take an awfully strong rope and an even stronger arm, but I suppose anything is possible in the West." "That's what Pa says too," Jack nodded solemnly. Then, tugging her hand, "Come see what I've been working on, it's a surprise." He led her around the side of the house to Rebecca's garden, now in full summer bloom. In one corner, partially hidden by a flowering shrub, stood a small, rough wooden bench. Jack released her hand to gesture proudly at it. "I made it for you, with Pa's help," he added honestly. "So you'd have a place to sit when you visit and tell stories." Hannah's throat tightened with emotion. The bench was clearly a child's work, the legs slightly uneven, the seat not quite level, but it was sturdy and had been sanded smooth, then painted a cheerful yellow. "Jack, this is wonderful," she managed, running her hand along the seat. "Did you make it all by yourself?" "Pa showed me how to measure and saw, but I did most of it," Jack said proudly. "Do you really like it?" "I love it," Hannah said and meant it. She sat down, finding that, despite its imperfections, the bench was surprisingly comfortable. "It's the perfect storytelling spot." Jack beamed, then looked past her and called, "Pa, Mrs. Morgan likes my bench." Hannah turned to see Daniel standing a few yards away, watching them with a soft expression that made her heart skip. He approached, nodding his approval at the bench. "He's been working on it for weeks," Daniel told her. "Wouldn't let me help much beyond the basic instructions." "It's perfect," Hannah repeated, touched beyond words by the thoughtful gift. Jack, pleased with her reaction, began chattering about his other projects and the stories from the book he wanted her to explain. Daniel eventually interrupted gently to suggest they let Mrs. Harding know their guest had arrived, as dinner would be ready soon. The meal was as delicious as Hannah remembered, with Mrs. Harding hovering nearby to ensure everyone had second helpings. Conversation flowed easily, with Jack providing most of the entertainment with his school adventures, and Daniel occasionally adding a droll comment that made Hannah laugh despite herself. After dinner, at Jack's insistence, they returned to the garden so Hannah could fulfill her storytelling obligations from her new bench. Daniel settled nearby with a pipe, listening as intently as his son while Hannah recounted the tale of John Henry, the steel-driving man who challenged a steam drill. "Was he really as strong as all that?" Jack asked when she finished, his eyes wide. "The stories say he was," Hannah replied. "Sometimes when people do extraordinary things, the tales grow in the telling. Like when Billy Simpson said he shot a mountain lion, but it was really just a big bobcat," Jack asked. Daniel chuckled. "Exactly like that, though to be fair to Billy, a bobcat is still nothing to sneeze at." As the afternoon waned, Jack reluctantly went inside for his nap, extracting a promise from Hannah that she would still be there when he woke up. Once they were alone, Daniel offered to show Hannah the new foals born that spring. She accepted, glad for the distraction of activity to ease the tension that seemed to hum between them whenever Jack wasn't present. The foals were charming, all gangly legs and curious noses. Hannah found herself laughing as one particularly bold colt tried to chew on her sleeve. Daniel watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that made her cheeks warm. "It's good to hear you laugh," he said quietly. "You have a beautiful laugh, Hannah." She ducked her head, embarrassed by the compliment. "The foal is funny, anyone would laugh." "Perhaps," Daniel allowed. "But not everyone laughs with their whole being like you do." Hannah didn't know how to respond to that. She stroked the foal's velvet nose, focusing on the animal rather than the man whose presence made her increasingly aware of herself as a woman, not just a widow or a rancher. "Hannah," Daniel said after a moment, his voice serious, "I've been thinking about what I said when I last visited you." She glanced up, her heart suddenly pounding. Oh, Daniel stepped closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. I meant what I said about enjoying your company. But I want you to know that I don't have any expectations. Your friendship is enough, your partnership in the cattle business is enough. I won't press for more than you're willing to give. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Hannah felt something inside her give way, not the last of her defenses, but perhaps the beginning of an opening. Thank you, she said softly. I enjoy your company too, Daniel and Jax, more than I expected to. It wasn't a declaration of affection, but it was the most Hannah could offer right now. From Daniel's smile, it seemed to be enough. They walked back to the house in companionable silence. Jack was awake by then, eager to show Hannah his collection of interesting rocks and feathers. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly, with Jack's chatter filling any potential awkward silences. As the sun began to set, Hannah knew it was time to return home. Pete brought the wagon around, and Daniel helped her up onto the seat after she'd said goodbye to Jack, who made her promise to return soon. Thank you for coming, Daniel said, his hand lingering on hers as he handed her into the wagon. It meant a lot to Jack. And to you. Hannah asked before she could stop herself. Daniel's eyes held hers, serious now. And to me, he confirmed. Very much. Hannah nodded, not trusting her voice. As Pete drove her home through the gathering dusk, she found herself thinking about Daniel's words, about his patience and his understanding. He wasn't pushing her, wasn't demanding more than she could give. He was simply there, a steady presence offering friendship and perhaps, eventually, something more. For the first time since Thomas's death, Hannah allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future that included love again. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Summer progressed, bringing with it the intense heat of the Arizona desert and a gradual thawing of Hannah's resolve to remain emotionally isolated. She visited the Dawson ranch regularly now, usually on Sundays but occasionally during the week as well. Each visit strengthened her connection to Jack, whose unguarded affection was impossible to resist, and to Daniel, whose patient friendship was slowly becoming something deeper. They never spoke directly of this shifting relationship, but it was there in the way Daniel's hand would sometimes brush hers as they walked, in the way his eyes sought her out across a room, in the quiet conversations they shared after Jack had gone to bed. Hannah found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. In late July, a summer storm brought welcome rain but also trouble. Hannah was awakened in the night by a tremendous crash, followed by the panicked squawking of her chickens. She threw on a robe and grabbed her shotgun, hurrying outside to find that a large branch had fallen from the cottonwood tree, crushing part of the chicken coop. Several hens had escaped and were running around the yard in distress. By lantern light, Hannah managed to round up most of the chickens and secure them in the barn. The coop would need significant repairs, but that would have to wait until daylight. Soaked to the skin and exhausted, she returned to the cabin just as dawn was breaking. She had barely dried off and changed when she heard hoofbeats approaching. To her surprise, it was Daniel, looking worried and slightly disheveled, as if he'd ridden out in a hurry. "Hannah," he called, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Are you all right? We could see the lightning striking near your property last night." The concern in his voice warmed her despite her exhaustion. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Though my chicken coop didn't fare so well, a branch came down in the storm." Daniel insisted on seeing the damage. When he saw the crushed coop and the branch, which was more like half the tree, he whistled low. "You're lucky it didn't hit the house. This would have gone right through your roof." Hannah hadn't considered that possibility, and the thought sent a chill through her despite the warm morning. "The chickens are all safe in the barn for now, but I'll need to rebuild the coop." "I'll help," Daniel said immediately. "In fact, if you don't mind, I'll send a couple of my hands over with lumber. We can have it rebuilt by the end of the day." Hannah started to protest that she could manage on her own, then stopped herself. There was no shame in accepting help, especially when it was offered so freely. "Thank you," she said instead. "That would be very kind." Daniel smiled, relieved by her acceptance. "Good, now have you had breakfast?" You look exhausted. She hadn't, and she was. Daniel insisted on making coffee while Hannah sat at the kitchen table, suddenly too tired to argue. As he moved around her small kitchen with surprising familiarity, Hannah found herself watching him with a new awareness. In the early morning light, with his hair tousled and his shirt sleeves rolled up, Daniel Dawson looked entirely at home in her cabin. The realization should have unsettled her, but instead it felt right somehow. "You didn't have to ride all the way out here to check on me," she said as he placed a steaming mug before her. "I've weathered storms before." Daniel sat across from her, his own mug cradled between his hands. "I know you're capable, Hannah. That's never been in question. But when I saw the lightning last night and knew you were out here alone." He trailed off, his expression troubled. "I needed to make sure you were safe." The simple admission touched Hannah deeply. How long had it been since someone had worried about her safety? Since someone had cared enough to ride out at dawn just to check on her. Thomas would have done the same, she knew. The comparison didn't hurt as she might have expected. Instead, it felt like a confirmation of something she'd been slowly coming to accept, that caring for Daniel didn't diminish her love for Thomas. The two existed separately, each valid in its own way. "Thank you," she said softly, "for caring." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers warm around hers. "I do care, Hannah, very much." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then the sound of more riders approaching broke the spell. Daniel released her hand and stood to look out the window. "That'll be Pete and the boys with the lumber," he said. "We'd better get started on that coop if we want it finished before dark." The day passed in a flurry of activity. Daniel and 3 of his ranch hands worked efficiently to clear away the fallen branch and rebuild the chicken coop, larger and sturdier than before. Hannah provided food and drink, occasionally helping with the construction, but mostly grateful to have so many capable hands making quick work of what would have taken her days to accomplish alone. By late afternoon, the new coop was complete, painted a fresh white to match the cabin. Hannah's chickens were rehoused in their improved quarters, clucking contentedly as if nothing had happened. "It's better than before," Hannah marveled, standing beside Daniel as they admired the finished structure. "Thank you, all of you." Pete and the other hands tipped their hats, pleased with her praise. Daniel dismissed them to head back to the ranch, saying he would follow shortly. Once they were alone, he turned to Hannah with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the storm and you being out here alone." Hannah tensed, anticipating an argument about her ability to manage on her own. "I've been fine for over a year, Daniel. I know," he said quickly, "and you would continue to be fine. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Hannah Morgan," but he hesitated, then forged ahead. "But I worry about you out here. If something happened, if you were hurt or sick, no one might know for days." "What are you suggesting?" Hannah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting that perhaps it's time to consider whether this solitary existence is what you truly want, or if perhaps you might be ready for something more." There it was, the question that had been hovering unspoken between them for weeks. Hannah looked away, her gaze falling on the rebuilt chicken coop, the repaired barn, the small cabin that had been her refuge and her prison since Thomas's death. "I made a promise," she said quietly, "at Thomas's grave, that I would never love again, never risk that kind of loss again." Daniel nodded, his expression gentle. "I understand. I made similar promises after Rebecca died, but Hannah, do you think Thomas would want you to keep that promise, to spend your life alone?" The question struck Hannah like a physical blow. Would Thomas want this for her? The man who had loved her enough to bring her west, to build a life with her, to dream of children and growing old together, would he want her to reject the possibility of happiness in his name? "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wouldn't. He would want me to be happy." Daniel stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "And what would make you happy, Hannah? Not what you think you should want or what you promised in a moment of grief, but what your heart truly desires now." Hannah looked up at him then, seeing the hope and the fear and the love in his eyes. The answer came to her with surprising clarity. "I want to stop being afraid," she said. I want to live again, not just survive, I want. She faltered, not quite ready to say the words aloud. But Daniel understood anyway. He reached for her slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't, he drew her gently into his arms. I won't rush you, he promised, his voice low and fervent. We can take all the time you need, but know this, Hannah Morgan, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day when you refused my flowers and then worked beside me fixing that fence without a word of complaint. Hannah leaned into him, allowing herself to feel the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. I'm still afraid, she confessed, of losing again. So am I, Daniel admitted. Every day, but I've learned that the fear of loss can't be greater than the joy of living fully. Otherwise, what's the point of any of it? His words resonated within her, echoing her own unspoken thoughts. Slowly, Hannah raised her face to his. I think I might be falling in love with you, Daniel Dawson, and it terrifies me. Daniel smiled, a smile so full of tenderness that it made her breath catch. Being terrified is a perfectly reasonable response to falling in love, he said. But you're the bravest woman I know, Hannah Morgan, and you won't face the fear alone. Not anymore. Then, with infinite gentleness, he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that felt like coming home and embarking on a new adventure all at once. Hannah's arms slid around his neck, drawing him closer as she returned the kiss with all the emotion she'd kept bottled inside for so long. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Hannah found herself smiling a real smile that felt foreign on her face but wonderfully right. What happens now? She asked. Daniel tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. Now, we take it one day at a time. I court you properly with flowers and Sunday dinners and perhaps the occasional fence repair. Jack will be ecstatic, he already adores you. And eventually, when you're ready, perhaps we talk about combining our lives as well as our cattle operations. The future he painted sounded so much brighter than the solitary existence Hannah had resigned herself to. There would be challenges, she knew. Grief didn't disappear overnight and old fears wouldn't be easily banished. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Hannah felt truly hopeful about what lay ahead. I think I would like that, she said softly. One day at a time. Daniel sealed this new understanding with another kiss, this one more assured but no less tender. As the setting sun painted the desert in gold and purple, Hannah Morgan stood in the circle of Daniel Dawson's arms and silently thanked the husband she had lost for loving her enough to want her happiness above all else. Autumn arrived in a blaze of color, transforming the desert landscape with subtle shifts of light and temperature. The cattle partnership between Hannah and Daniel had proven successful beyond either's expectations, with the first calves from their combined breeding program showing all the hardiness and quality they'd hoped for. But the true transformation had been in Hannah herself. Under Daniel's patient courtship and Jack's unabashed affection, she had gradually opened herself to the possibility of a new life, one that honored Thomas's memory without being shackled by grief. Daniel had been true to his word, courting her with old-fashioned courtesy. He brought flowers each time he visited, not just wildflowers now, but occasionally store-bought blooms from Cottonwood Springs that must have cost more than was sensible. They took Sunday drives in his buggy, attended church together, causing a flurry of gossip in town that Hannah found she didn't mind as much as she'd expected, and spent long evenings on her porch or his, talking about everything and nothing as the stars emerged above. Jack had indeed been ecstatic about the change in their relationship. "Does this mean you'll be my new ma?" he'd asked Hannah directly one afternoon as they fed the chickens together at her ranch. The question had taken Hannah aback, not because she hadn't thought about it, but because she hadn't expected Jack to be so forthright. "Would you want that, Jack?" she'd asked carefully. The boy had nodded vigorously. "Pa says my real ma would be happy if we were happy. And I'm happy when you're here. Pa is too." He smiles a lot more now, out of the mouths of babes, Hannah had thought, touched by the simple wisdom of the child. "Well, your pa and I are taking things slowly," she'd explained, "but I care for both of you very much." This seemed to satisfy Jack, who had then launched into a detailed explanation of his plan to build a bigger chicken coop at the Dawson Ranch for when you bring your chickens to live with us. Now, on a crisp October afternoon, Hannah stood in her yard watching Daniel approach on horseback. His visits were regular now, but still, her heart quickened at the sight of him tall and straight in the saddle, his familiar silhouette outlined against the blue sky. "You're early," she called as he dismounted. "I wasn't expecting you until supper time." Daniel grinned, the smile that never failed to warm her from the inside out. "I had a good reason to hurry," he said, drawing something from his saddlebag. "This came on today's stage from Denver." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Hannah looked at him questioningly. "What is it? Open it and see," he encouraged. Hannah unwrapped the package to find a small velvet box. Her breath caught as she opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single, perfect pearl. "Daniel," she breathed, looking up to find him watching her with nervous anticipation. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "My grandfather gave it to her when they came west together in '32. They were pioneers like us." Hannah's fingers trembled slightly as she touched the pearl. "It's beautiful." Daniel took the box from her hands and removed the ring. Then, to Hannah's surprise, he dropped to one knee right there in the dusty yard. "Hannah Morgan," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "this past summer has been the happiest of my life since Rebecca died. You've brought joy back into my home and my heart. Jack adores you and he paused, swallowing hard. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love again. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Although they had been moving toward this moment for months, hearing the words spoken aloud made them real in a way that stole Hannah's breath. For a heartbeat, the old fear surged. What if she lost him too? What if she wasn't strong enough to survive another loss? But as she looked into Daniel's eyes, Hannah found her answer. Love wasn't safe, it never had been, but a life without love wasn't really living at all. And Thomas, dear, loving Thomas, would be the first to tell her to grasp happiness with both hands when it was offered. "Yes," she said, her voice firm despite the tears that threatened. "Yes, I will marry you, Daniel Dawson." Daniel's face lit with such joy that Hannah felt her own heart might burst with happiness. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her, then stood and pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love. When they finally parted, Hannah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "When?" she asked simply. "Christmas," Daniel suggested. "That would give us time to prepare, and it would be a new beginning at the close of the year." Hannah nodded, liking the symbolism of it. "Christmas it is. A small ceremony, though, just family and close friends." "Whatever you want," Daniel agreed, "though Mrs. Harding will insist on baking enough to feed the entire territory, small ceremony or not." Hannah laughed, picturing the housekeeper's enthusiasm. "And Jack, have you told him your plans?" Daniel grinned. "Who do you think helped me choose the ring? He's been bursting with the secret for weeks." The thought of Jack being involved in the proposal touched Hannah deeply. They were already becoming a family, the three of them, finding their way together. That evening, after Daniel had returned to his ranch, with a promise to bring Jack for Sunday dinner the next day to celebrate, Hannah sat on her porch watching the sunset. The pearl on her finger caught the dying light, glowing softly. She touched it gently, still scarcely believing the turn her life had taken. "Thomas," she said softly to the gathering dusk, "I think you would like him. He's a good man, kind and strong like you were. And he has a son who needs a mother." She paused, emotion tightening her throat. "I'll always love you. You were my first love and nothing can change that. But I think my heart is big enough for this new love too." The desert breeze seemed to whisper around her, warm and comforting like an embrace. Hannah closed her eyes, feeling at peace for the first time in longer than she could remember. The future stretched before her, not empty and lonely as she had once feared, but full of promise and new beginnings. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, with a rare dusting of frost silvering the desert landscape. In the bedroom of her small cabin, Hannah stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Gone was the gaunt-faced widow in faded black. In her place stood a bride in a gown of deep ivory silk, her cheeks flushed with happiness and anticipation. Mrs. Harding, who had arrived at dawn to help with preparations, fussed with the final touches, arranging the lace collar just so, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the skirt. "You look beautiful, my dear," the older woman said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Just beautiful, Mr. Dawson won't know what hit him." Hannah smiled, a flutter of nerves and excitement in her stomach. "Thank you for all your help, Mrs. Harding. I don't know what I would have done without you." "Nonsense," the housekeeper replied briskly, though she looked pleased. "Now, are you ready? The wagon should be here any minute to take us to the church." The small church in Cottonwood Springs had been decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the holiday. As the wagon approached, Hannah could see that despite her wishes for a small ceremony, quite a crowd had gathered. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the wedding of the widow Morgan to Daniel Dawson. "So much for a quiet ceremony," she murmured as Pete helped her down from the wagon. "Can't expect folks to miss the wedding of the season," Pete grinned. "Especially on Christmas Day. It's like getting two celebrations at once." Inside, the church was warm and fragrant with pine. Hannah waited in a small antechamber while the guests were seated. Through the door, she could hear the murmur of voices and the occasional burst of laughter. A soft knock announced Jack, looking solemn and important in his new suit. "Pa sent me to check if you're ready," he said. "He's as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs." The boy delivered this expression with such a perfect imitation of Mrs. Harding that Hannah had to laugh. "Tell your father I'm ready," she said, adjusting Jack's slightly crooked tie, "and that he has nothing to be nervous about." Jack nodded, then hesitated. "Mrs. Morgan, Hannah, I'm really glad you're going to be my ma," he said in a rush. "I've been wishing for it for a long time." Hannah knelt, heedless of her silk dress, and hugged the boy tightly. "And I'm so happy to be your mother, Jack, so very happy." When Jack had gone to deliver his message, Hannah took a moment to collect herself. So much had changed since that day in April when Daniel had ridden into her yard with wildflowers. She had gone from a woman determined never to love again to a bride about to begin a new life with a man and a child who had somehow mended her broken heart. "I'm ready," she whispered, though whether to herself or to Thomas's memory she wasn't sure. The small church had no organ, but someone had brought a fiddle, and the sweet strains of Beautiful Dreamer filled the air as Hannah walked down the aisle alone. She had considered asking the sheriff or another respected townsman to give her away, but in the end, she had decided that she would give herself to this marriage freely, fully, with eyes and heart wide open. Daniel waited at the altar, Jack standing proudly at his side. The look on Daniel's face as he saw her approach was one Hannah knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Wonder and joy and love so profound, it seemed to illuminate him from within. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices steady and sure. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation were seen to dab at their eyes. The reception was held at the Dawson Ranch, where Mrs. Harding had indeed prepared enough food to feed the entire territory. The house was filled with laughter and music, with friends old and new celebrating not just Christmas, but the union of two people who had found love after loss. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to set, Daniel found Hannah standing alone for a moment on the porch, watching the changing light on the distant mountains. "Happy, Mrs. Dawson?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. The new name sent a thrill through her. "Very happy, Mr. Dawson," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "I have something for you," Daniel said, producing a small package from his pocket. "A wedding gift." Hannah unwrapped it to find a locket, simple but beautifully crafted in gold. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph of Thomas on one side. "Daniel," she breathed, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "The other side is for us, you, me, and Jack," he explained. I thought you might want to keep them both close to your heart." The past and the present. Tears filled Hannah's eyes as she looked up at her new husband. How did you know? How did you know exactly what I needed? Daniel smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Because I understand, Hannah. Rebecca will always be a part of me, just as Thomas will always be a part of you. But we're fortunate enough to have found love twice in our lives. That's not something everyone gets. Hannah fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her skin, not a burden but a comfort, a reminder of all she had loved and all she had found. Thank you, she said simply, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Daniel kissed her again, a promise for the future they would build together. Come, he said when they parted. Our guests will be leaving soon, and Jack is about to burst if he doesn't get to give you his gift. As they turned to go back inside, Hannah paused for one last look at the setting sun. The desert was turning gold and purple in the fading light, the same colors she had seen the day Daniel first rode into her yard with flowers. Then, she had been alone and determined to remain so. Now she was surrounded by the love of her new husband, her new son, and the memory of Thomas, who would always hold a place in her heart. Thank you, she whispered again, this time to the man who had loved her enough to let her go, and to the one who had loved her enough to help her find her way back to living. Then, with her hand in Daniel's, Hannah Dawson stepped into her new life not without fear, but with faith that love was worth the risk, and that happiness could be found even after the deepest loss.